Well, tonight we are delving into what could be one of the worst decisions for our democracy. This is the first time in the history of the country the Justice Department has weaponized to such a serious degree a sitting president has allowed former President Donald Trump to face federal charges in a state court. Now, after a 5-week trial in Manhattan, Donald Trump was found guilty on 34 counts of falsifying business records. Take a look.
Former President Donald Trump is a convicted felon. Let that sink in.
This was a rigged trial by a convicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace.
Silence in the courtroom from former President Donald Trump and his team as each of those 34 counts of guilty were read aloud. Reporters inside the courtroom noting his face was red as he turned to leave. On Friday, Trump addressed the media, building on his claims that the trial was rigged, describing Judge Juan Merchan as conflicted and corrupt, while providing no evidence for his claims.
If they can do this to me, they can do this to anyone. These are bad people. These are, in many cases, I believe, sick people. So we have a judge who's highly conflicted. You know what the confliction is. Nobody wants to write about it, and I'm not allowed to talk about it. If I do, he said, I get put in jail.
Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg praised the jury for their work on this case.
We have the most important voice of all, and that's the voice of the jurors. They have spoken. Donald J. Trump has been convicted of 34 counts of falsifying business records.
All of this stemming from Trump's efforts to cover up a hush money payment to adult film star Stormy Daniels ahead of the 2016 presidential election. Trump has continually denied the payment and any affair with Daniels.
Well, if this could happen to ex-President Donald Trump, it could happen to any one of us. I believe that this is a travesty of justice. I believe it was unfair to Donald Trump and an abuse of our legal system with damaging consequences. And this is not about Donald Trump. This is about abuse of process. This is about due process. And this opens a Pandora's box of extreme proportion. And joining me tonight to discuss this historic case are former prosecutor and News on Merritt Street anchor Lonnie Coombs, and my good friend who has left an indelible mark on the courtroom, a Dallas trial lawyer for 50 years, recognized as one of the best lawyers in this city 11 times, just an absolute brilliant legal mind with a commitment to justice, Mr. Rod Phelan. Welcome these experts, please. Now, Rod, I have said that I thought this was a travesty of justice, and I guess what I'm talking about is the fact that this was a case supposedly about hush money. This was a case about business records that were supposedly illegal. And first off, let's talk about the hush money that this whole thing was predicated on. There's a problem with that. And the problem is that there's nothing wrong. This is a made-up term to sound scandalous, but that's just another term for a non-disclosure agreement, is it not?
There are thousands, millions of non-disclosure agreements. Their very purpose is to hush up the person who is receiving the payment to be quiet. That's what a non-disclosure agreement is. And this prosecution in this case was allowed to say that paying her for silence was illegal. But she had no duty to tell that story. She had every right to keep it quiet or sell it. And paying her to keep that story quiet was, you can be critical of it. You can think that wasn't a nice thing to do, nor was her story a nice one to hear. But there was absolutely no crime involved in paying her to keep that story quiet. And that's the heart of the case, that this was an illegal payment.
But if there's no crime in paying someone to not tell a story that is not flattering, if there's no crime in that, Lonnie, then how is there a case to be brought against a defendant based on how you keep those records?
Right. So the prosecution theory in this case was that there were falsified documents, right? So we all know having an affair is not a crime. Paying hush money is not a crime. Having an NDA is not a crime. But when it is done by someone who is running for political office, that person is now subject to laws and rules under campaign finance rules, election laws, that the normal person isn't. So if we did an NDA, we wouldn't have anybody looking at us so closely. But if we are running for office, then all of a sudden we have these other rules applying to us.
Okay, but keeping the records, this was not a campaign expense. This was a personal expense, was it not?
So that is what the prosecution said. No, it was a campaign expense, and they talked about it being, if it was not done within the time that it was done, right before the election, that is what the prosecution believes showed was the intent to interfere with the election. So Stormy Daniels came forward in 2016 and tried to sell her story at the beginning of the year. Nobody wanted it. Nobody cared about it. When the Access Hollywood tape came out in October 7th, just before the election, then all of a sudden the negotiations started to try and work out this deal with Stormy Daniels. It was actually done. The money was wired on the 27th. So the prosecution said, this is evidence of intent to try and interfere with the election. It's not just a typical payment, hush money, NDA. It is because of the timing of the deal, because of everything else that was going on in the campaign. That's what they said showed that this was an attempt, an intent to interfere with the election.
What do you say to that, Rod?
Well, the prosecution did pitch the case as a, quote, election fraud case, pure and simple. But election fraud has to be something that was illegal that happened before the election. But Trump was only indicted for creating records about paying Cohen back after the election. Trump was not charged with doing anything before the election. So if what you're charged with doing happened after the election, it can't be an election fraud case.
No, but your point is this happened in 2017 is when they made these entries, these bookkeeping entries, was after the election.
That's right, that's right. And that's the interesting thing. So the way the prosecutor had to file this was the initial argument, the initial charge is falsifying the documents, right? So all of the payments were falsified because they said they were legal expenses, it wasn't this reimbursement.
After the election.
And they were all paid after the election. However, the prosecution put on a case that said the agreement that was made between Trump and David Pecker, and David Pecker testified to this, and Michael Cohen, this arrangement to try and keep these bad stories out of the press started way back in August of 2015.
And was not illegal.
No, that arrangement's not illegal. However, that's part of it. And then when the payment was made to Stormy Daniels at the time just before the election, that part goes into the financial documents. So the financial documents were actually not falsified until after the election. You're absolutely correct.
But the payment was not illegal.
No, well, that's what the prosecution is saying. It's not the hush money payment that's illegal. It's the intent to interfere with the election by making that to suppress the story.
Right. All right. Well, we've got to take a break. We're going to talk more about this. Coming up, why Rod says there were skunks in the jury box. He'll explain what he means by that right after the break. If you're worried about IRS collection tactics, you don't have to face them alone. Tax Network USA is here to help. Tax Network USA is the nation's premier tax relief firm and has negotiated over $1 billion in tax relief for clients. Our services include penalty forgiveness, hardship programs where you might not have to repay anything until your tax debt expires, and offer in compromise solutions for lump sum settlements. Whether you owe $10,000 or $10 million, our experts are ready to assist you. Even if you're behind on taxes due to missing personal or business records, Tax Network USA can guide you through the process. Tax season is long over, and for the IRS, that means it's collection season. To schedule complimentary consultation, call 1-800-958-1000 or visit tnusa.com/Dr. Phil. Don't let the IRS's aggressive tactics control your life. Take charge of your financial future. Visit tnusa.com/Dr. Phil today.
It was a rigged trial. We wanted a venue change. where we could have a fair trial. We didn't get it. We wanted a judge change. We wanted a judge that wasn't conflicted. The judge allowed them to go into everything that I was ever involved in, not this case, everything that I was ever involved in, which is a first. Was he a bad boy here? Was he a bad boy there? We weren't allowed to use our election expert under any circumstances. You saw what happened to some of the witnesses that were on our side. They were literally crucified by this man.
Well, I'm here tonight with former DA Lonnie Coombs and former Dallas trial lawyer Rod Phelan discussing Donald Trump's historic guilty verdict. Now, I want to look quickly at a timeline of what took place here, because in 2006, Daniel says she had sex with Trump. He says not so. Then 2015, Trump decides to run for president. And then in October of 16, this is a month before the election, Daniel's lawyer makes a $130,000 hush money demand, and Trump's lawyer, Cohen, pays it. November 2016, he wins the election. February 2017, he starts paying Cohen back plus taxes. Now, November 2020, Alvin Bragg makes a campaign promise that if he's elected DA, he will go after Trump. He wins. And then in April 2023, DA Bragg indicts Trump, and then in April 2024, he tells the jury in an opening statement that this is a case of election fraud, pure and simple. And then in May 2024, the jury convicts Trump. Now let's back up to the one right before being convicted. And that's where he says that he tells the jury in opening statements, this is a case of election fraud, pure and simple. And he makes a campaign promise that he's going to get him. Now, here's the thing. He says he made illegal payments. Were those payments illegal?
They were not by any stretch. And the fact that a campaigning politician made them does not alter that conclusion. Anybody can pay for silence if the person he's paying has no duty to tell the story she wants to tell. If she's free to sit on that story or tell it or sell it, paying her does not become a crime, whether you're a politician or anyone else.
All right, do you agree with that?
No.
You don't agree with it because?
Because I think the law of what the prosecution's arguing here is that it's not just a hush money payment. That could have been made back in 2016 at any time, years before. It was made 2 weeks before the election. It was done, arguably, is what the prosecution is saying, it was done with the intent to make sure it did not come out before the election, and that is considered to be election interference. That's what they're arguing. If it's done by unlawful means, right? Unlawful means, and then we're getting into the jury instructions of—
Rod?
Election interference is not a crime. He was charged with falsifying business records to cover up a legal payment. So the charge was not you interfered with the election. That was the lawyer's argument, the prosecutor's argument. But that's not a crime. So they twisted the law, which makes it legal to pay someone to sit on a story she has no duty to tell, to make it a crime, election interference, which isn't a crime. And then they used something that happened after the election to shore that up.
Well, it's in the jury instructions given to the jury about the election crime. That was
it
the
in the
predicate.
indictment?
So the indictment, no. And that, believe me, there's issues with the legal case. I'm not denying that at all. I agree there are many issues with the legal case.
Well, that's
I'm
a
just
yes or no question. Was it in the indictment?
No, it was not. It was not. And not only that, that there was a lot that wasn't in the indictment that the DA then put into a statement of facts later. But the issue and the problem with that is every defendant under the Sixth Amendment of the Constitution has the right to know the charges against them. In this case, the indictment didn't lay all of this out. In fact, no one found out about this until during the trial.
Isn't that a bit of a problem?
That is a problem.
A huge problem.
That's a very big question of whether due process was violated here.
Yeah, and that's what we're saying. If you get charged with something, you kind of ought to know what it is.
Right.
And if you go on trial for something, you ought to kind of know what you're being tried for.
That's right.
Because you kind of want to make your defense in response to what you're being tried for. And if you don't know that until during the trial,
Yes.
that's a problem.
Yeah.
There were two things going on here, in my view, with the way the prosecutor charged this case. He charged only falsifying business records. But he put out a separate document that he didn't want to charge Trump with doing, but it said he violated the federal campaign contribution laws, he violated the federal tax laws, and he committed election interference by conspiring to make this payment before the election. Well, a New York prosecutor's got no jurisdiction over federal campaign contribution law or federal tax law, and he knew better than to actually try to prove that this payment for silence was a crime. He argued it, but didn't ask the jury to find it and didn't charge for it.
He just prejudiced them with all of that information. And you agree he didn't have jurisdiction.
No, the way I see it is that he laid out, he charged falsifying of business documents, which he can do. But the problem with it is that was a misdemeanor. The statute of limitations had run, so he couldn't just stick there. So then he had to add a predicate crime to make it, in other words, a second crime to make it a felony.